Do come in, take a seat. Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Lechadello.
What's happening this week with Super Tuesday primaries and what could well be Joe Biden's final State of the Union address coming up?
And the Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump can stay on the ballot, so he might just have an election after all. Let's get to it.
And we'll start this week with a unanimous ruling by the United States Supreme Court that the state of Colorado has no right to bar Donald Trump from the primary ballot under the insurrection clause of the 14th Amendment. All of the justices agreed that individual states cannot disqualify candidates for the presidency because they determine the candidate is an insurrectionist. Or, as CNN's Jake Tapper put it,
they said he participated in an insurrection,
Nikki Haley should be president for just keeping a straight face through all of that. A majority of 5 Supreme Court justices went a little further, though. They asserted the US Constitution makes Congress, rather than the states, responsible for enforcing Section 3 against federal office holders and candidates, and qualified that further by saying that federal legislation was required to determine who was disqualified under the provision. Former President Donald Trump, speaking at his golf club in Florida, welcomed the ruling.
They worked long, they worked hard, and frankly, they worked very quickly on something that will be spoken about 100 years from now and 200 years from now. Extremely important. Essentially, you cannot take somebody out of a race because an opponent would like to have it that way.
That is a long, long tie. Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold, writing on X Twitter, said that she is disappointed with this decision and that Colorado should be able to bar oath-breaking insurrectionists from their ballot. To which Cat Turd 2 replied, 9-0, you commie fascist. Now, this ruling not only ensures that Trump is on the primary ballot in Colorado, he will be on every state ballot he qualifies for come November's general election, which we assume, Chaz, is going to be all of them.
Yep, this is really not a surprise ruling at all, John. But honestly, their logic is fairly tortured. They're saying that a state can't disqualify a federal candidate under the 14th Amendment. You need federal legislation to execute it, right? So then why have states in the past excluded would-be presidential candidates for not meeting age requirements or for not being natural-born citizens? Both of them are from the 14th Amendment. It seems inconsistent.
Take it up with the court, fella.
Well, just wait, I've got more. The minority found an even more glaring contradiction. They noted that Section 3 of the amendment states that when someone is disqualified, Congress can remove that disqualification with a 2/3 supermajority vote in each house. Fine. But if a simple majority can nullify Section 3 by repealing the executing law, like the Supreme Court just held, then why would Congress require a 2/3 supermajority to remove the disqualification? See, it doesn't make sense that you can vote with a majority to put in a disqualification, and presumably you can vote with a majority to get rid of it. But the same provision in the Constitution says you need a 2/3 majority. It suggests someone has got it wrong. I will take that with the court. It's weird. It makes no sense. But anyway, the tortured logic is obviously there to avoid the political problem of removing Trump from the ballot.
Yes.
But given that, at least the majority did go all the way. They did not leave any loose ends hanging, John. They even described exactly what kind of legislation would be required to disqualify a candidate. They held that any congressional legislation enforcing Section 3 must reflect congruence and proportionality between preventing or remedying that conduct and the means adopted to that end, which is complete legal gibberish. It means absolutely nothing. But they did thankfully explain what that meant. They said they weren't aware of any other legislation by Congress that would do to enforce Section 3 other than the Enforcement Act of 1870 and the current federal law against rebellion or insurrection. In other words, since the Enforcement Act of 1870 has been long since repealed, it's actually very simple. The only way Trump can be disqualified, according to the Supreme Court, is if you convict him of insurrection or rebellion. That's it. Coincidentally, After last week's announcement the Supreme Court was hearing Trump's immunity appeal, there is now no longer time for Jack Smith to charge Trump for insurrection or rebellion. Gosh darn it, what a coincidence that is. This also means that on January 6, 2025, Congress can't just decide that Trump isn't qualified. So that closes that loose end as well. So whether you agree with the Supreme Court or not, they certainly have tied up the whole issue neatly in a little bow.
Yeah, they certainly just wanted to say, tell you what, yeah, nah, over to you voters. Speaking of which, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley made history this week. She became the first woman ever to win a Republican Party presidential primary. She stormed to victory, I tell you, over former President Trump in Washington, D.C.
This is Haley's first primary win of the 2024 campaign. So that means she gets D.C.'s 19 delegates. Haley got almost 63% of the votes here in the district. Former President Donald Trump landed in second place with about 33%. He's still considered the front-runner for the GOP nomination.
Yes, he is, and a look at the fine print there tells us exactly why. Nikki Haley's almost 63% of the vote consisted of exactly 1,274 votes. Total. Trump got 676. He explained his defeat this way.
I purposely stayed away from the D.C. vote because it is the swamp with very few delegates and no upside. Per Brain spent all of her time, money, and effort there.
He meant to lose.
Yeah, exactly. I meant to do that. Meanwhile, Trump did have big wins over the weekend in Idaho and in the Missouri caucuses. There was a Michigan caucus on top of their primary last week. Trump won that one as well. He also won a caucus in North Dakota on Monday night. And 16 states and one territory voted in the Super Tuesday primaries today. Let's zip through those real quick, Chaz, starting with Alabama,
Trump,
Arkansas,
Trump,
California,
Trump,
Colorado,
Trump,
Maine,
Trump,
Massachusetts,
Trump,
Minnesota,
Trump,
North Carolina,
Trump,
Oklahoma,
Trump,
Tennessee,
Trump,
Texas,
Trump,
Vermont,
There's a surprise, Haley!
Virginia,
And back to Trump. Wow, that was super.
Amid concerns from many voters that President Joe Biden is too old to serve a second four-year term, his doctor has declared Biden continues to be fit for duty and fully executes all of his responsibilities without any exceptions or accommodations. This report details treatment of known conditions including sleep apnea, atrial fibrillation, reflux, seasonal allergies, and Biden's stiffened gait due to osteoarthritis. And it concludes that he is a healthy, active, robust 81-year-old male who remains fit to successfully execute the duties of the presidency. Coming less than a month after the now notorious non-medical summation from Special Counsel Robert Hur that Biden came across as, quote, an elderly man with poor memory and having, quote, diminished faculties in advancing age, Whitehouse reporters wanted to know if Biden's doctor had conducted a cognitive test.
The president doesn't need a cognitive test. That is not my assessment. That is not my assessment. That is the assessment of the president's doctor. That is also the assessment of the neurologist, who has also made that assessment as well. And, you know, and you've heard us say this, and I'll reiterate this, the president's doctor has said, if you look at what this president, the president who is also the commander-in-chief, he passes a cognitive test every day.
But the voters are not convinced. Not even Biden supporters. A poll from Siena College for the New York Times this week found 73% strongly or somewhat agree that Biden is just too old to be an effective president. That's compared to 42% who say the same about Donald Trump, who is 4 years Biden's junior. And there was plenty of bad news in this poll for Joe Biden, Chaz, with 45% of Democratic primary voters saying that Biden should not be their party's presidential nominee, although, to be fair, that is down from 50% who said the same last year. So they're getting to, I don't know, the acceptance phase in all of this, Chaz?
Yeah, I think there might be. There's been a lot of focus on that New York Times poll, John. Too much focus, actually, I would argue. After all, the bad news does not end there for Biden when it comes to polling. Over the last month, Real Clear Politics has logged 20 general election polls. Trump has been ahead in 16 of them to 2, with 2 ties. But let's dive into this poll in particular. Number one, because everyone's obsessed with it. And secondly, I actually do think there are some interesting elements to this poll. The top line is Trump leading 48% to 43%. Now, that's the largest lead that Trump has ever had in a Times Siena or Times CBS poll since he first ran for president in 2015. But I think that top line is a little bit misleading, actually, because the biggest change since the last New York Times poll, when Biden was up by 2, was that back in December, their sample had an even partisanship, whereas this sample has a 3-point lean to Republicans. Now, in November, you can expect a slight registration advantage to Democrats, because that's been the case for decades. There are also some fairly sus demographic results in this poll, like Biden non-white support tumbled to just a 49% to 39% lead, just a 10-point lead, compared to the 2020 election when non-whites backed Biden by 69 to 21. That's almost a 50-point lead. Now, I think you can expect some non-white drift to Trump this year, but a 40-point drift, that is incredibly unlikely. Joe Biden's primary challenger, Dean Phillips, put it best, I think, when he tweeted out that when the New York Times Siena poll shows me at 12%, you better believe it's flawed. Only 5% even know who I am. He did actually tweet that out. Okay, so what were those interesting bits in this poll that I referred to before? Well, firstly, all the movement in polls lately has been Biden moving downwards. Trump hasn't gone up a jot. Compared Trump's favourable numbers in October 2020 to his favourables in 2024, they're basically the same. Now, compare Biden's favourable numbers in October 2020 to his favourables in 2024, he's dropped 14 points. Ouch! And this is reflected by how much of their 2020 support these two have maintained. Trump is still winning 97% of those who said they voted for him 4 years ago. But Biden is winning only 83% of his 2020 voters, with 10% of them now backing Trump. Even Biden's own supporters don't really like him that much. Only 28% of Democrats are enthusiastic about Biden becoming a Democrat nominee. Unsurprisingly, 0% of Republicans were enthusiastic about Biden being the Democrat nominee. But get this, 30% of Democrats were enthusiastic about Trump being the Republican nominee, presumably because they love to hate him. So literally, more Democrats are enthusiastic about beating Trump than about voting for their own guy. Another interesting element of this poll is it suggests that age in itself might not necessarily be much of a factor. I mean, sure, like John said, 73% of voters say Biden's too old to be effective as president. And 61% of 2020 Biden voters agree with that, which sounds worrying. But 59% of people who right now say they are going to vote for Joe Biden also say he is too old to be effective as president. It's baked in. So clearly Biden's age isn't nearly as big a factor as people's attitudes towards the other guy. That's why they're voting for someone who they think can't be effective as president. Which is not to say that Biden does not have a substantial handicap. He does. Because if we ask people whether Trump or Biden's policies helped or hurt them personally, independents clearly thought that Trump's policies helped them more. It was even the same for Biden's base of support. Women thought Trump's policies helped them more, 39% to 18%. Hispanics thought Trump's policies helped them more, 37% to 15%. Even black people thought Trump's policies helped them more, 26% to 17%. Biden hasn't shut up about black people for the last 3 years. He's been trying to help them, but they think Trump helped them more. So maybe that's because Trump was so good to women, Hispanics and black people? Or maybe it's because Biden is a woeful communicator, partly because of his age. And I'll tell you why I do think that's a factor. Even on infrastructure, Morning Consult found voters trust Trump more, 43% to 37%, despite Trump doing absolutely nothing on infrastructure for 4 years and Biden passing one of the biggest infrastructure bills in history. Infrastructure Week was a joke under Trump, and yet they still trust him more. Trump is just a better salesman. And this matters because Biden is winning amongst the voters who say neither Trump nor Biden's policies made a difference to them. When Trump hasn't made the sale, Biden's in front. So the selling counts. And this leads us to what this election may end up being about. a lot of those ex-Biden voters, they're going to come home. The partisan leaning of the election will be different than was in the New York Times poll. You can expect later polls are going to tighten up. Then this may come down to what the 2016 election came down to. Who does best amongst the voters who hate both guys? In 2016, the double haters broke heavily for Trump, 69% to 15%, and they represented 14% of all voters. That is why Trump won. Well, in this poll, they represented 19% of all voters, a historically high proportion, and they broke for Biden 45 to 33. Now, that's the only good news for Biden in this poll. Except, John, this time there might be a bunch of third-party candidates in the polls snaffling up all those double hater votes. If you hate those two, then go for this other person. And if they take all the double hater votes instead of Biden, then he might be done. So we're going to find out over the next few weeks which of these third-party candidates exist. This could be really important.
Election 2024. What's at stake?
In this moment, we are witnessing a full-on attack on hard-fought, hard-won freedoms. The freedom to vote, the freedom from fear, violence, and harm, and the freedom to just simply be.
This Friday, America's 46th President, Joe Biden, will deliver his third State of the Union address before Congress. These annual rituals almost always end with an optimistic declaration.
And that's why I stand here as confident as I have ever been that the state of our union is strong. Thank you.
Woo!
Oh,
yeah, whoa!
Although some presidents do like to switch it up a little bit.
The state of our union is sound.
Boo!
I can't believe he lost. State of the Union addresses are sometimes momentous, though, like Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech of 1941. It's almost a year before the US was dragged into the Second World War by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor.
Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere.
Okay, yeah, all right.
It seemed important at the time. Sure. Sometimes these speeches can be fateful, like George W. Bush in 2002, just 4 months after 9/11.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
That's not good.
No, it didn't work out well either. Sometimes State of the Union addresses are surprisingly candid, like when Gerald Ford summed up the national mood after Richard Nixon's resignation over Watergate.
And I must say to you that the State of the Union is not good.
Oh, get Obama back.
Yeah, mostly these speeches, Chaz, are dull, predictable and forgettable. We'll soon see which category this week's one falls into, but there's probably nobody better to talk about States of the Union than James Fallows. He was the Whitehouse Director of Speechwriting for President Jimmy Carter, an award-winning journalist and author. He was the longtime national correspondent for The Atlantic. Jim Fallows, welcome back to Planet America.
John, thank you. It's always a pleasure to join you all.
So come clean, that 1978 State of the Union for Jimmy Carter, where you came up with the State of the Union is sound rather than the State of the Union is strong. Did you work on that one, Jim?
I did, and there are two great challenges for any State of the Union address. One is that every single part of the government wants to cram in the paragraph or the sentence or even the word that will acknowledge what they're doing so they can use it as leverage in budget fights over the coming year. And the other is there has to be a sentence in there saying the State of the Union is X. And it has to be some variant on good or excellent or promising or struggling but moving ahead, et cetera. So the way that scrum turned out back in 1978 was sound. The State of the Union is sound.
Jim, these kinds of speeches do often become laundry lists where everyone gets a mention. Do you approve of that tactic, or do you think it's better to focus on just a few major topics and to get them right? And if so, what should those topics be?
So there are certain things that are eternal in life, you know, the struggle between good and evil, the struggle among elder and younger siblings, et cetera. One of those is the struggle to make this State of the Union different from everyone that's ever come before, because the planning always starts out, oh, this one, we know how these become these really long laundry lists, but this time we're going to do something thematic That's always the intention. It is almost never the result. And I think the challenge that Biden actually has done in his previous addresses is to have a couple of things he's going to talk about. And I think, the implied thing he's going to have to talk about is his general fitness and agility and readiness for the task ahead. But also he's going to have to say something about the warfare underway in Israel and Gaza. He's going to have to say something about the state of the economy, which he can brag on, say something about immigration. So I think I would imagine the speech will be 4 or 5 sort of large, meaty chunks of things that he has to talk about.
And what should the approach be, Jim? Should Biden be reminding people what he has achieved, or does he need to be projecting forward, not just to the year ahead, but potentially to a second term ahead?
That is another shrewd question. I think that, Biden's implied message is we've started a lot of things, they're going along, but that we can't stop them now. We can't pull things out by the roots. So he wants to suggest what the next 5 years from now might mean if he were at the helm, but he can't skip past the events of the next 8 months or however long it is at this point. So I think it's mainly going to be finding some way to look back on what has been accomplished during his time, which on the numbers economically has been almost phenomenal. And his legislative record is, I think, comparable only to Lyndon Johnson's, Lyndon Johnson had a virtually unanimous Democratic House and Senate he was working with long ago. So I think he wants to look back on the things, how far we have come, and that's to address the feeling that, the economy might look good on the numbers, but it feels bad to so many people. And then the other thing is that he wants to convey his vigor as he's shown it in the past 3+ years, and as he hopes to demonstrate it in the year ahead and time after that.
This is going to be an hour-long speech. Joe Biden does not make a lot of hour-long speeches these days, more like 15 minutes. So what's your advice for how he can get through unscathed?
You always want to have a contrarian view on these shows. I know it's part of what all of your viewer base, including me, enjoys. The contrarian point I'd make is that Joe Biden has actually become quite a good long form, as we say, speaker. There's a series that I've mentioned sometimes online of 4 speeches he's given over the past 3 years on the meaning of democracy. These were all very long. They were 45 minutes or almost an hour themselves. They were well written, and he actually does his best in settings like this. He does his worst when being yelled at by the scrum in the press room and, saying, well, yeah, he doesn't handle that well, as few people do, other than, say, stand-up comics could handle that, but not Biden. But I think, surprisingly enough, this actually is the top range of his oratorical repertoire. But maybe he doesn't want anybody to know that inside the U.S. So if he does well, it'll be a surprise and beating expectations.
So, Jim, given the reservations have been raised about Biden's age and his mental fitness, how high would you say the stakes are for him? Because presumably every pause, every stumble, any moment he's confused by the auto cue could become a major issue.
Sure, and we saw the case a couple of weeks ago when Biden misspoke and called the president of Egypt the president of Mexico. And in most of the news reports in the following 24 hours, the news anchors themselves screwed up in various ways in relaying this, but obviously the stakes are higher when you're an 81-year-old president running for re-election. So I think that it is, there is nothing Biden can do frontally to deny the fact that he's he's already the oldest person ever to be in this office and is running to be in there for another 4 years. But I think that the stakes are high. It's not clear to me clearly nobody who is still with Donald Trump is swayed by the 50 things that Trump misspeaks or hallucinates about every day. So the question is whether anybody in Biden's range of getables will be swayed if his lifetime stutter shows up as making him pause in enunciation. So he wants this to be a success, and most of his big speeches have been, but the stakes are high.
Jim Fallows, a pleasure as always. Thanks for being with us on Planet America.
John and Shaz, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure.
The The story of America's 9th and shortest-serving president, William Henry Harrison, has always had an ironic appeal to it. On the day he took the oath of office on the 4th of March 1841, Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in presidential history. 8,445 words.
Blah, 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 blah.
It was a cold, wet day, and 68-year-old Harrison spoke outdoors for around 2 hours without an overcoat or hat to show how youthful and vigorous he was. The president then appeared at a parade and 3 inaugural balls in those damp clothes. So, the story goes, Harrison developed a cold which turned into pneumonia, and barely a month later, he was dead. But there may be a different answer to the question, what killed William Henry Harrison? The president's doctor, Thomas Miller, reported at the time,
on Saturday, March 27, 1841, President Harrison, after several days' previous indisposition, was seized with a chill and other symptoms of fever.
That's more than 3 weeks after Harrison's inauguration.
The next day, pneumonia with congestion of the liver and derangement of the stomach and bowels was ascertained to exist.
Doctors tried heated suction cups to draw out the disease, laxatives, enemas, mercury, opium, bleeding, and native remedies, all to no avail.
Finally, on the 3rd of April at 3:00 p.m., profuse diarrhea came on, under which he sank at 30 minutes to 1 o'clock on the morning of the 4th.
By sank, he means died, but experts now challenge Dr. Miller's diagnosis. They say Harrison's cold symptoms are more in keeping with septic shock, and his cause of death was likely bacterial enteric or typhoid fever. They say that is what caused the derangement of stomach and bowels and the profuse diarrhea. The culprit, the water supply for the Whitehouse, the Potomac River. It was contaminated by untreated human sewage, and it was probably responsible for the deaths of 2 other presidents in that period as well. James Polk endured severe gastroenteritis and died shortly after leaving the White House in 1849, and Zachary Taylor died in office the following year. There were rumours he was poisoned by an assassin, but we now know the killer was probably microscopic. Now, before we go, quick update for you on a story we brought you a couple of weeks ago.
This morning, new questions about the future of fertility treatments after Alabama's Supreme Court ruled that frozen embryos are children.
That ruling, effectively giving a few fertilised cells the same legal status as a teenager, saw Alabama IVF clinics halt procedures for fear the destruction of any embryo would see them sued for wrongful death. Well, this week, the Alabama state legislature sprang into action with what amounts to a short-term fix.
These bills are not a long-term solution. Instead, they're meant to shield IVF patients and doctors from prosecution and civil suits during the course of fertility treatments where embryos could be damaged or destroyed.
But this new law does not address the question of whether embryos are considered legally children. So this case could still fuel the debate over stricter abortion time constraints, which does remain a major campaign issue in 2024, Chaz.
Yeah, the other thing that this law does is it whipsaws IVF protections in the other direction. Now, in Alabama, no legal action, lawsuit or prosecution for the damage or death to an embryo shall be brought or maintained. None.
Gosh.
So now IVF can be as negligent as they like.
Do what you like.
With your embryos, exactly. Have a party with them. In Alabama, you can't sue them for any reason whatsoever to do with IVF. And that is not what anyone was asking for. Not the Democrats, no one. But that's what they've got.
Ain't democracy grand. But that's it for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you for a fireside chat on Friday night on ABC News, including a look at Joe Biden's State of the Union address.
And you can catch both Planet America and Fireside Chat on iView at 9 p.m. each Wednesday and Friday, and back here on ABC TV at the same time next week.
Bye-bye.